welcome to AP U.S. History with Lennox. Today we're talking about a 6-year period of time in U.S. history when America was inevitably heading towards war. 1854 to 1860. I refer to this time period as a crisis of our Union because that's what we were experiencing, a crisis, trying to determine who we were going to be and where we were going to go. Before we get started, as usual, we got to hit the terms. We got to know the language of history in order to understand history. So go ahead, take a moment, look through this list and see what words and terms you know and don't know. And as usual, like I said, if you don't know a term, go ahead, pause the video, write it down, and then you can visit it as we talk about it in our discussion. So I'll give you a few minutes. All right, that's enough. Let's start with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, let's look where we're coming from. 1844 to 1850, basically that is the culmination of manifest destiny in our country. Polk got elected. He was able to extend our borders from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We then went into a dispute with Mexico and fought the Mexican-American War, which at the end of that, after signing the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, best treaty in the world, we are going to find ourselves with a whole lot of new land, not only California, but pretty much most of the Southwest of modern-day America. So the question becomes, how do we settle it? And more specifically, what do we do about slavery in these new territories? Now, California is going to come in as a free state, and that's going to be under the Compromise of 1850. But there were several other conditions of that compromise, one of them being that the New Mexico-Utah territories would actually determine the question of slavery based on popular sovereignty, meaning the people got to decide whether or not they would allow slavery into their territory. So that's where we are. As we move forward, you're going to see that same question come up in Kansas. Now, interestingly, Kansas and the territory of Nebraska both fell under what would be deemed the Missouri Compromise because that land is part of the Louisiana Purchase. But Stephen Douglas had a goal for America, and that goal was to build a transcontinental railroad. He also had a goal for his home state of Chicago to get that railroad to go through his state, basically the northern route of the Transcontinental Railroad. So what he's going to do is he's going to introduce the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And with that, we're going to divide the remaining Louisiana territory into two separate territories, Kansas and Nebraska. And then what he's going to do is say in those two new territories, we're going to allow popular sovereignty to determine the question of slavery. Now, why would he do that? And quite simply, it was to get the support of the South for that northern route of the railroad. You see, when the dream of building a transcontinental railroad came up, everyone knew that whatever route it took, it's going to benefit every single town along that line. And so you had people in the South who wanted the route to go through there, and then people in the North who wanted to go through there. Douglas is hoping that if he offers popular sovereignty to slaveholders in Kansas and Nebraska, that would be enough to sway the vote towards a northern route transcontinental railroad. And so that's what gets passed. The Kansas-Nebraska Act gets passed, and as a result, the Missouri Compromise is going to be repealed. Now, believe it or not, there's some people unhappy with this. Go figure. People in the North are unhappy because all of a sudden this huge territory is now going to be open to slavery at the whim of the people who live there. And so what you're going to start seeing is you're going to start seeing people in the North kind of start drifting away from their, I guess, uncaringness about slavery. I'm not thinking of the right word, but they didn't have a lot invested in slavery in the South. They really didn't care about slavery in the South. But now slavery's starting to creep its way into the North, so they have some concerns. So that's going to start to creep in. We're also going to see the beginning of a brand new political party. The Republicans are coming, so hang on. At about the same time, or in the same era of time, you're going to see some more resistance to the Compromise of 1850, more specifically the Fugitive Slave Law in the North. I've said in previous videos, and you might want to check those out. I did a video on sectionalism where I talked about the Compromise of 1850. And what I said was there was 5 key parts to that compromise. probably the most controversial part of the Compromise of 1850 is going to be the Fugitive Slave Act. What they did was they strengthened it to a point where Northerners could be held liable if they are not assisting in the capture of fugitive slaves. So if you know of a fugitive slave and don't help capture, you could end up in jail. Well, as a result of that, Harriet Beecher Stowe is going to write a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. This book's going to come out in 1852. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe is part of the Beecher family, those strong abolitionists from the 1830s and 40s. And she's hoping her book, which highlights the fugitive slave law and how it works, she's hoping that that's going to inspire others in the North to start resisting it. And so as the book is distributed, and actually more copies were published, I think it was the second most published book at the time other than the Bible, you started to see people create, or not create, but started seeing people, their perceptions of slavery start to change, especially in the North. See, what Harriet Beecher Stowe did was she put a human element to slavery, and she painted a picture. And in the book, she exposed the horrors and the violence of slavery. And so you're going to see a lot of people in the North say now it's not a question of economics, it's not a question of politics, it's a question of morality. Now, at the same time, those in the South were angry about this book because they said that it didn't present or represent the mainstream Southern population. They said, you took the worst of the worst in our society, and that's what you wrote about, but we're not like that. So you are misrepresenting who we are. And so that schism, that divide between North and South is just growing wider and wider and deeper and deeper. Now let's get back to Kansas. What effect does that have on Kansas? Because all of these things are kind of tied together one way or the other. In Kansas, now that they have popular sovereignty, just like that was introduced in the Compromise of 1850, you're going to see a wave of supporters on both sides flooding into Kansas. Now, one group of abolitionists from the North, the New England Immigrant Aid Company, started recruiting free soilers to go settle in Kansas. And they probably used that book to inspire people to move there, to defeat this spread of this evil institution of slavery. And so they're going to be sending people in there. The New England Immigrant Aid Company is also responsible for what were called Beecher Bibles. Beecher Bibles were actually rifles that were sent into Kansas in crates marked Beecher Bibles. So they're prepared to go to war over this, and the actions that they're taking prove that. But it wasn't just the anti-slavery side that was willing to do that. It was the pro-slavery side as well. Folks in Missouri started, ginning up people to go across the border. We called them border ruffians, and they go in and they try to, quote, influence others to vote for a pro-slavery style of government and stuff. And so you have people, abolitionists coming in, you have the border ruffians coming in, and the two are going to clash. As people come into Kansas, what ends up happening is two governments are going to be created, the Topeka government and the Lecompton government, each one representing one side of the argument. The Topeka government is a free soil government. They don't want slavery to expand in their territory. The Lecompton government is a pro-expansion government. They want to allow slavery in Kansas. And so you have these two viewpoints coming at each other. And the question is, which side is going to have control of Kansas? And it all comes down to votes. That's bottom line. That's why all these people are going in there, because eventually residents of the territory are going to have to vote on their new state constitution. And whether it will be anti-expansion or pro-expansion, it all comes down to the number of votes. And that's why so many people are going in there. Now, you do have people going in who are going to try to influence this vote. And at this point, that's how the Republican Party is starting to evolve and come into fruition. Basically, interesting though, it didn't start in Kansas, it started in Wisconsin, but the Republican Party is going to form with the groupings of anti-slavery Whigs and these free soilers who are looking to stop the expansion, and as well as Northern Democrats who are disillusioned with, this slave movement, because the Democratic platform had typically allowed, supported slavery, or at least the expansion of slavery. And since the book has come out and things are changing, you have Democrats in the North who don't want that to happen. They want to stop the expansion, and they're going to kind of all join up together to form the Republican Party. But what happens in Kansas is we start to get a glimpse of what is to come in America. And we call it Bleeding Kansas because it's not just people pouring into the state for voting privileges. It's people pouring into the state to try to physically influence others to vote a certain way. In 1856, we have the sack of Lawrence, which was a free soil town. Lawrence, Kansas was a free soil town that was attacked by pro-slavery forces. And I don't believe anyone was killed in that. I think where I read some places, the only thing that died in the sack of Lawrence was the printing press, but there was people who were roughed up, beaten up, I don't know to what extent, but they're invading their town. And then you also have others who are going to even further extremes. And one of them is John Brown. He and his followers are going to be responsible for a massacre at Pottawatomie Creek, where 5 pro-slavery men are going to be killed. Now, these are just 2 examples, but this was going on throughout the state. And I don't want to just say that one side was killing while the other wasn't, because they both were. And both were responsible for death, and both were responsible for destruction. And what we saw in Kansas was basically a civil war. 1856, Kansas was like the preview of what was to come in that. And what it also shows us is that we have a real problem with popular sovereignty. And it's not just in Kansas, it actually happened in Congress too. Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts is going to be giving a speech on the floor of the Senate, and he's going to be condemning the actions that are going on in Kansas at that time. During his speech, he is going to call out several senators, one of them being Andrew Butler from South Carolina. Now, the thing was, Andrew Butler wasn't on the floor at the time. He was sick and out of Congress. And without going too far into detail, Southerners have this level of honor where they have to stand up for their family when they're not able to stand up for themselves. And Butler's nephew, Preston Brooks, is going to basically be insulted by what Sumner is saying about a member of his family, and he's going to charge the Senate floor, and he's going to start caning, basically taking his cane and beating down on Charles Sumner. It's referred to as either as Bleeding Sumner or the caning of Sumner. And though, it's kind of a comical, situation when you think about it, the people on the floor of Congress fighting, it was where we had gotten to as a society, that we're now using violence in order to spread a message. And that's how we're moving closer and closer to the Civil War. The election of 1856, you're going to see 3 key candidates come out. James Buchanan is going to be the Democrat nominee, and he was nominated for one reason and one reason only. He had not been in America for about 12 years. He had nothing to do with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He had nothing to do with the Compromise of 1850. He'd been over in England, and what the Democrats needed was a candidate with no baggage, and that was James Buchanan. The Republicans nominated their very first presidential candidate, and that's going to be John C. Fremont. John C. Fremont, as you know, is from the Bear Flag Revolt in California, known as the Pathfinder and all that. And then finally, Millard Fillmore. Vice President Zachary Taylor took over the office when Taylor passed away. Well, he's back. He's running for the Know Nothing Party. The Know Nothings were an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic political group, more typically known as the American Party. These 3 men are going to run against each other, and though Fremont had a very good showing in the northern states, it will be James Buchanan who wins this election, which is not what America needed, because Buchanan is not ready to run this country at all. One of the first challenges he's going to face is the Lecompton Constitution is going to come to Congress. That's right. Kansas had their vote, and they voted for the Lecompton, the pro-slavery Constitution. Now, there was a hiccup. Free Soilers had actually boycotted the election. They didn't vote at all. So their votes were not even in the record. Now, Buchanan supported this Constitution. He said, oh man, they had an election. This one won. We'll go with it. But Congress didn't buy it. They recognized that the problems in Kansas, that this was not a valid election. So they're going to reject the Lecompton Constitution. But here's the thing, guys, what we're seeing very quickly in Kansas, popular sovereignty doesn't work when it comes to the question of the expansion of slavery. It wasn't the solution that people needed, and they're not getting the results that they wanted. The Dred Scott case plays a big role in all of this. It also is going to play a key role going down the line. Dred Scott was a slave whose master had passed away and left him to his wife. His wife ends up selling him and his family to another family. Well, Dred Scott had been living in a free state with his former owner. And so he thought by virtue of geography, he should gain his freedom. So he is going to sue for his freedom, and it's going to be heard at the Supreme Court. Now, Roger Taney was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he was a Southern Democrat. And he and the other justices rule that Dred Scott has no standing because he's African American, and African Americans were not citizens in our country. And if you're not a citizen, you do not have the right to have your case heard in a court of law. On top of that, at this point, they could have left it at that, but they went further. And this is where I think you got some more legislation from the bench than you actually got a judicial ruling. What Taney and the other justices said was that property cannot be taken away by the federal government. As such, slaves are property. Now, slaves have always been considered property. I don't want to paint some different picture, because we can go back to census records and tax records, and you can see where slave owners actually listed slaves, whether they had 1 or 2 or they had 50 or 100. They listed those slaves as property on census tickets and tax records, and they usually had to pay taxes on their property. Well, Taney says that the federal government has no power over that property. I mean, let's go all the way back to John Locke. Government's supposed to protect our property, our natural rights, life, liberty, and property. And so that said, Congress can't really make any laws regarding slaves because as property, they need to be protected by the government, not restricted. And so he is going to declare the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. Now we know that the Kansas-Nebraska Act technically repealed the Missouri Compromise, but Taney and his court is taking this way further by declaring it unconstitutional. Now it's like the law never existed. So the question is, do we really even need the Kansas-Nebraska Act or the Compromise of 1850 or anything like that for popular sovereignty? I mean, what's going on? And that's going to be debated in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Abraham Lincoln, who had been a congressman in 1846, remember the spot resolution going into the Mexican-American War? Well, he's back. After taking a hiatus and we're practicing his law in Illinois, he's going to run for Senate against Stephen Douglas, the presiding senator from Illinois. They're going to have a series of 7 debates throughout the state of Illinois, and the primary topic of those debates is popular sovereignty versus Dred Scott. In fact, does popular sovereignty have any standing now that now we have the Dred Scott ruling? And what's interesting is Stephen Douglas made a little bit of a faux pas at the debate in Freeport. He is going to institute what became known as the Freeport Doctrine, in which he said that while the government might not be able to rule on slavery, local government, specifically the police, can decide what they want to enforce and what they don't want to enforce. So if slavery is technically allowed, what if the police just choose not to not to enforce that, and they're going to start, running after slave owners? Or, what if they're just, if slavery is voted down, what if they just allow slaves to stay? And so there's that Freeport Doctrine that's going to cause some concern, not only with the Southerners who are thinking, well, even if we do get the right to take our slaves into new territories, the local law is not going to protect us. But there's also Democrats saying, hey, wait a minute, these laws are in place, and, what if the police choose not to enforce the laws that are already there? So you can kind of see where there's some people are looking at Douglas as, and the Democrats as, hey, what are you guys doing? Douglas is going to end up winning this Senate seat. But what's more important is Lincoln is going to be vaulted to national politics. He's going to be well known. The transcripts from these debates are going to be shared in newspapers across the country so people know who Lincoln is. And the divide even deeper now because the Southerners are ticked, the Democrats are ticked. The Democrat Party actually splits at this point. So it's getting ugly out there. Finally, let's talk about John Brown's raid. This is another act of violence that is going to scare Southerners. And that's going to be when John Brown, remember Pottawatomie Massacre, Bleeding Kansas, he and his sons are going to come into Virginia and they're going to raid the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. The goal, to get as many caches of weapons as they can, which they will then use to arm escaped slaves in the South. And he's basically going to build his own army. And they're gonna march to the South and end slavery their way with violence. John Brown, he was expecting a whole lot of slaves to try to escape and come join his movement. No one showed up. So it's just him and his sons. He's going to end up being captured by all people, Robert E. Lee, who was still in the American Army at that point. He will be charged with treason, convicted, and he will be executed. He will be hung. Here's the problem. In the North, he's becoming a martyr. And in the South, he's looked at as a demon because the South is angry. They're seeing this possibility of a Northern uprising to come down and overtake their way of life. And they believe that they truly started to believe that the North was conspiring to do this, and John Brown was just the first that they were going to send down. Now, at the same time, up in the North, they're thinking the South is conspiring to, like I said in a previous episode, to create this slaveocracy, to expand their foothold of slave-holding Americans throughout the entire country, and then they'd have complete control. I'm going to tell you right now, both sides are completely wrong. Both sides are paranoid about what the other side might do. But what's going to happen is those people that we talked about in earlier episodes, those Southern radicals who kind of started, whispering about secession back in the 1840s, early 1850s, that voice is getting a lot louder now. The idea of secession is becoming more mainstream in the South. The election of 1860 is going to be that point of no return. You're going to have 4 candidates running. For the Democrats, remember, they split. The Northern Democrats are represented by Stephen Douglas. He is going to run on the platform of popular sovereignty and enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. Remember, a lot of Northerners don't like that. And then you have the Southern Democratic candidate, John Breckinridge. He is running on the platform to allow slavery to expand into territories, as well as let's go ahead and annex Cuba. Talking about the Ostend Manifesto there. For the Republicans, Abraham Lincoln. Now let's look at the Republican platform because it's very important you understand this. The very first rung of that platform, no extension of slavery. They're going with the free soil platform. So we don't want slavery to extend into the territories. Notice what I'm saying. No extension of slavery. There's nothing there about ending slavery, but that's the fear people have if Lincoln gets elected. They think Lincoln's going to get elected and the next day slavery is going to be abolished. In fact, Lincoln just wanted to stop the expansion of slavery and then hopefully work towards gradual emancipation over a long period of time. Now, the protective tariff is going to be on the platform as well. This is going to help Northern merchants, Northern industrialists. A building of the Pacific Railway, the Transcontinental Railroad, they're still trying to get that done. And then homesteads in the West for small white farmers, places where they can go, get free land from the government, and start fresh. Southern secessionists look at Lincoln's platform and say, that's it, we got to go. If he is actually elected, we're out of here. And that's what they start threatening. If Lincoln becomes president, the South will secede. The election of 1860, Lincoln gets elected. One other candidate that was on there too is John Bell. John Bell was part of what was called the Constitution Union Party, and they tried to use the old Zachary Taylor method of just not talking about slavery at all. His goal was just to keep the Union together. Well, if you notice on this map, Lincoln takes the states in the North, Breckinridge takes the states in the South, Bell gets a few states in the middle, and well, Stephen Douglas gets 2 states. The states Lincoln win is enough to give him a majority in the Electoral College, so he will win the presidency of 1860. South Carolina says, we out of here. December 1860, South Carolina officially secedes. Before Lincoln even comes into office, 6 more states will follow. They create the Confederate States of America, they draft their own constitution, and they place Jefferson Davis as the president of the Confederate States. Alexander Stephens will be his vice president. So where's Buchanan in all this? Why is he not doing anything? Because he truly believes that secession was absolutely illegal, but he didn't do anything about it. He just kind of sat on his hands and said, let's just let the next guy take care of it. And the next guy's going to be Lincoln. And what Lincoln gets when he comes into office is a war. I mean, literally, less than a month after he takes office, the war starts. One last attempt for peace, and it's the Crittenden Compromise. And this was presented on the floor of Congress saying, can't we just try one more thing? Let's just go back to the way it was with the Missouri Compromise and the 36-30 line. Now, it's not that they necessarily wanted to re-implement the Missouri Compromise, but the ideal of that. Let's just get a geographical line that divides our country. North of it is free states, south of it is slave, and just leave it at that. Well, the Republicans put that down right away because that's not the platform they ran on. They said, we got elected on the platform on stopping the expansion of slavery, and that's what we're going to press on with. So we're not going to allow any new slavery in any new territory of our country. What's interesting to me, and this is just a side note, the Crittenden Compromise kind of reminds me a little bit of the Olive Branch Petition from 1776. Do you remember 1776, Second Continental Congress? We had just had Lexington and Concord, and they're going to send the Olive Branch Petition to King George saying, hey, you know what? Let's just go back to a time right before the proclamation line of 1763 when we were all happy. Get it? It's another geography line. But here's the thing. Neither one are going to be accepted. The Crittenden Compromise is going to be shot down, and we are now on the path to war. And you can see from this map here, the first 7 states to secede are down there in the red, starting with South Carolina. And then the other 4 states that will join them, Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee and Arkansas, will join this Confederate States once the war, or once Lincoln comes into office. Virginia, North Carolina, or actually all 4 of them, are going to come in after the war starts. So please note Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Those were the official border states, very important to Lincoln. These are slave states. They will be permitted to keep their slaves throughout the war, but we'll talk about that later. So anyway, that's kind of where I want to stop today. Hopefully you guys got a little, historical knowledge going in your head right now. If you have any questions, feel free to post them below. If not, we will see you in our next video, which should be all about the Civil War. So you guys have a great day, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.